Chapter 1, Endor I. It was an uncommon honor to be a member of the vaunted Death Squadron, the personal fleet of Lord Vader himself. To have one's ship and name inducted into the official registry was the goal of many an Imperial officer, from the lowliest of enlisted all the way up to many of the Grand Admirals. Most gain their positions through acts of great heroism or through astounding victories that caught the attention of Lord Vader or one of his attendants. Fleet admirals might even see their own squadrons inducted wholesale if they were truly impressive enough. Blitzer Hask was one such fortunate soul. An admiral of considerable skill and accolades, Hask had made a name for himself across the Empire and beyond. His personal friendship with Admiral Firmus Piet, second-in-command of Death Squadron, managed to convince him to attach his fleet to Death Squadron for the final triumph against the rebellion. This meant that Blitzer's subordinates were, at least temporarily, inducted into Death Squadron alongside their commanding officer. A dream many had achieved because their commander knew a ranking officer within Death Squadron. Beggars can't be choosers. This is my story, the tale of a captain set adrift in a rapidly collapsing galaxy. A tale of victories and defeats, heroism and villainy, triumph and failure. This is the story of Captain Riviger Tullius, through the final days of the Galactic Empire. I cannot claim to be an especially skilled officer. That is not to say I am incompetent by any means, just compared to my commander and peers I might not be quite up to snuff. My name is Riviger Tullius, captain of the Conqueror and of the 2nd Flank Squadron. My job under Admiral Hask is as can be expected from the name, to guard the flanks of the main force during operations, and pursue fleeing enemy ships. This job might appear a little beneath the composition of my squadron, that being the Conqueror and Intimidation, Imperial I-class star destroyers, and an odd assortment of a dozen support craft, but Admiral Hask's aggressive style necessitated sizable coverage. At least, necessitated in theory. Admiral Hask was as old guard came. Not in regards to his age, but rather because of his tactics. Hask was trained and experienced in classical forms of naval warfare, with focus on capital ship brawling and large, cohesive formations. A symptom of the Clone Wars, or so I've been told, but hopelessly ineffective against the current threat in the galaxy. Unlike the separatists of yesteryear, the rebellion does not fight in pitched battles, nor do they strive to meet in open combat. Admirals like Hask often spend their time hunting down small skirmishing forces, bogged down by their relatively slow tactics and ships. To make a long-winded explanation slightly less so, my actual job within the fleet was to ensure the upkeep of both ships and the assorted supporting craft. Neither my ships nor I have ever been in a pitched, proper ship-to-ship battle the likes of which Hask always drilled the fleet for. I was decidedly neutral about that fact. On one hand, the Imperial in me wanted the chance to prove my competence and bathe in the blood of our enemies. On the other, the reasonable sentient in me was decidedly against exposing my squadron along whatever extended flank Hask left us with. I, as an inexperienced officer, was not itching to die until I was well along in my career. I might have only obtained my position through dumb luck rather than my accolades, but getting myself or my men killed did not sit well. Of course, had I known then what I know now, I might not have been so dismissive of Admiral Hask and his lot. We were stationed over Yagthu, at the intersection of the Rimmer trade route and the Corellian trade spine, when the new orders came in. The fleet had been given temporary leave after our last operations in the outer reaches of the Slice turned up no recent sign of the rebels. We had been resupplying and resting over the planet. The given were equal parts courteous but clearly disdainful of our presence, before a missive was sent out across the fleet. Hask rarely held large meetings, in person or otherwise, so for him to call all the ranking captains and lieutenants to his personal flagship was a rare occurrence indeed. Captain Tullius, report to the Whirlwind immediately. Captain Bola Thoth. Short and to the point, Thoth was not a man of many words. Inform Commander Haran that the squadron is his and prepare my shuttle. Despite being born on the mid-rim world of Naboo, I had largely adopted the downplayed accent of Eriadu. It betrayed little, or so I like to think, but I was a nervous man at my core. My hand twitches, itching to reach for and stroke my sideburns, but I pressed it back down. My eyes did not move from the datapad that held my new orders, not that I needed to ensure the comms officer or my second aboard the Conqueror were following my orders. One of the few rare things I had confidence in was the effectiveness and professionalism of my crew. Imperial training was very strict, the officer spoke and the crew acted. While I did not have the commanding presence of other men of my rank, the ranking insignia on my chest ensured compliance. No, my mind was presently occupied by theories as to what Hask was planning. Yet, no matter how long I stared at the 5-word message, no answers leapt out to me. I cannot claim to be the most politically active. My decision to join the Navy was one driven by the desire to escape my overbearing mother and the constantly disappointed gaze of my father. Even I had not heard of any operations or situations pressing in the slice or beyond. I could not theorize very well simply because I did not have the foggiest idea. Deciding I had wasted enough time, my finger flicked the switch on the side of the datapad, deactivating it. The device was then passed off to the nearest technician as I walked by him. The man disappeared into the sea of grey and black uniforms, leaving me to navigate the miasma and begin the arduous trek to the hangar bay. My arrival by tram was greeted by my shuttle, a standard Lambda class with its remixed alphabet of a name, and a pair of armored stormtroopers. The men somehow managed to straighten their posture even further as I approached, the blasters held tightly to their chests. I did not speak to the troopers as I climbed the ramp to my shuttle, nor did they speak to me in turn. Something I had learned early in my career: stormtroopers were meant to be seen but rarely heard. They were the fists of the Empire, intended to appear inhuman and unapproachable to the common folk. This standoffish behavior might have been irritating to another officer, but I found them oddly comforting, silent guardians who neither judged nor questioned. The troopers filed in close behind me, claiming the seats nearest to the docking bay, and I sat to the rear. Pulling the small hand communicator from my belt, I opened communication with the cockpit. "Pilot, take us to the Whirlwind. Once I disembark, return to the Conqueror till I call you back." "Yes, sir." And with that, the communication was closed. A few moments passed, the pilot lightly running through the pre-flight procedures, before we set out. While the inertia dampeners did an admirable job of completely negating the feeling of flight, the subtle shifts of the shuttle betrayed that we were moving. The arrival was as untroublesome as the departure, and soon I was sitting among a crowd of my peers around a large conference table. Again, showcasing how out of my depth I was, many of the captains and even lower officers were several years my senior, with many of those being veterans of the Clone Wars. They had earned their place here through blood, sweat and seas of battle droids, a far cry compared to my skirmishes with enterprising pirates. My dark thoughts were silenced as a hush fell over the assorted officers. All eyes, mine included, were drawn to the new arrival at the front of the head of the conference table. Admiral Blitzer Hask, his severe expression lightened into a rare half-smirk, marched around the table before taking the head seat. As he went, he greeted some of the more notable officers quietly. Unsurprisingly, he passed me without comment. "Gentlemen," Blitzer began before he sat, sharp eyes gliding over the crowd of officers, "I have recently received a request from an old friend, Admiral Firmus Piet, who I am certain you are all familiar with." Indeed, I was. Firmus Piet, Admiral of Death Squadron and Captain of the Executor. The man was a legend in the officer circles, at least those I was actually part of before being brought into Arrowhead Command, not only surviving under Vader for years but also being one of the skilled or fortunate few to be granted command of a star dreadnought. I received word that the Emperor himself has concocted a plan to destroy the insolent rebels once and for all. A new Death Star has been in construction, and we have been granted the enviable honor of defending it under the banner of Death Squadron. Hask, showcasing a rare moment of his oratory skill, declared this to the crowd, standing again with a fist raised in the air heroically. The sea of Imperial loyalists, stoked by his words and the promise of victory over their decades-long foe, cheered and applauded the announcement. Another Death Star? My mind was racing at the possibility, even as I rose from my seat and applauded alongside my peers. In my old circles, thoughts on the Death Star, Now the first Death Star were mixed at best. The most patriotic members were for the battle station wholesale, viewing it and its destruction of Alderaan as a necessary evil for the safeguarding of galactic security. Others saw the Death Star as a colossal waste of resources, especially given that it was destroyed so soon after being unveiled. Others still, a silent group, viewed the Death Star as an abomination and the destruction of Alderaan a horrifying tragedy. I was of another opinion entirely. The Death Star was a necessary evil in principle. I was young during the Clone Wars, but I was old enough to remember the stories shortly after its conclusion. In a galaxy without order, there will only be destruction and death. The Death Star was the ultimate deterrent, a weapon capable of destroying the next Geonosis, Sereno, or Raxus Prime, against rebellion and war. However, actually using it to destroy a peaceful, loyal world like Alderaan, which had been a major proponent of galactic history for as long as there was history? That I could not agree with. Official records and testimonies state that the late Moff Tarkin, driven mad by his love and loyalty to the Empire, targeted the planet to force the hand of the treasonous Leia Organa, but how could a man driven by love do something so vile? It was a question I did not have an answer to, but it didn't make much sense. Still, another Death Star alongside the infamous Death Squadron? Hask had given us nothing on the current plan, but those two forces combined would be untouchable. Arrowhead Command was a powerful fleet by itself, but combining with Death Squadron and whatever other forces were being compiled? What threat could the rebels possibly bring to bear against that? I wondered, before feeling oddly apprehensive, what threat could necessitate bringing to bear all of us? But I continued to applaud all the same. The Conqueror dropped out of hyperspace, far from the gas giant planet of Endor. Even from this great distance, I could make out the dark shape of the Death Star. Having never seen the original in person, my first experience was certainly memorable. While it was dwarfed by the furthest moon that the battle station orbited, and certainly by the gas giant, the mere fact it was visible at this range, unlike the fabled Death Squadron, was a testament to its size. There it is, I murmured breathlessly, noting absently as the rest of the Arrowhead Command dropped out of hyperspace around my ship, the Death Star. My oar was joined by the crew. A brief survey of their expressions brought a small amount of amusement, as the usually rigorous bridge staff stopped what they were doing just to stare for a few moments. It was Lieutenant Ashka Skriold that broke from her stupor first, turning her gaze from the distant battle station back to me. Skriold was the youngest of my ranking staff by at least half a decade. She was a shorter woman, with the sort of rounded and cutesy face that hid her severe and no-nonsense personality. Even as a younger junior officer, she had earned a reputation as a tough person who did not suffer incompetence or excuses lightly. I had discovered her aboard my new ship and knew soon after our first meeting she would be my ideal second on the bridge. She had managed to worm her way onto the bridge crew not a year later through sheer competence and stubbornness, and commanded such a presence that even the veterans were impressed. I could have chosen a Clone Wars veteran to be my second, like Matred, my chief flight officer. It was certainly advised by some of my staff. My reasoning for picking her was twofold, one for strategic reasons and another for entirely personal. Regarding the first, I needed fresh blood to set new protocols and standards so that I would not need to conform to the old. Second, as a younger officer and someone lacking the pedigree of being a veteran of war, Skriold lacked the assuredness in command to contest me or go behind my back. She had the presence, yes, but not the ambition or cutthroat attitude older officers had. While I oversaw the tactical side of command, she ruled the bridge with an iron fist. A sign of her hard-headed professionalism came soon after snapping out of her stupor. "Captain, the Intimidation has dropped out of hyperspace. Only the Viscount and Intrepid are unaccounted for." I nodded at her words, keeping my expression decidedly neutral. While my more nervous and defeatist disposition was probably an open secret on the ship, I did my best to appear the imperious captain I was supposed to be. My words came out level and cultured, as my training dictated. "Very good. Order the Intimidation to fall in on our left flank. I will forward formation data to the rest of the section." The Viscount and Intrepid will join upon their arrival. Yes, Captain. Skriold saluted me before turning about and barking orders to those crew members that had not yet shaken their individual awe. Knowing she more than had the ability to see my orders enacted, I returned my attention to the scene before me. With such a force present, how could we possibly lose? The Battle of Endor began a week later, though how much was to plan remained a mystery. As a lowly captain, I was not made privy to what designs the Emperor and admirals hatched, but from my position, I could only bear witness to its effectiveness. Far from the gas giant and its moon, my small squadron had been sent on the greatly unimportant task of guarding the outer reaches of the system, an egress point, so as to catch any fleeing ships. It was to be expected, my ships were fairly outdated and my experience was lacking. But it still hurt my ego to be sidelined in such a fashion. The crew shared the sentiment to greater and lesser effects if their quiet grumbling was anything to go by. Still, thousands of kilometers away, I was able to watch one of the largest single battles in modern galactic history. Hundreds of the Empire's finest ships and officers against all that the rebellion had to muster certainly made a spectacular show. From our position near the primary hyperspace point, my crew and I witnessed the destructive power of the second Death Star as it effortlessly destroyed rebel ships with a single stroke. One of my attendants was sat near to the sensor officers, marking down the tactics and actions, creating a play-by-play report. Even if I could not participate directly, I could still learn from the battle by watching. The experiences learned would be applied to my playbook of tactics, to deal with any future rebels that would rise after this. There was the Whirlwind, pummeling a smaller rebel cruiser with its heavy batteries. The Avenger, former flagship of Admiral Piet, was moving nearer to the gas giant alongside two other ISDs to engage rebel forces on the flank of their fleet. The Eviscerator of Admiral Versio sat on the back line, providing supporting fire for the Executor. In the who's who of the Imperial Navy, nearly everyone who was anyone was participating in the battle. And I get to watch the whole thing. I muttered to myself, unsure if I was honored or bitter. Sir. Skriold, who I had not realized had approached me during my internal ruminations, asked with her usually stoic voice. Internally, I jumped at her unexpected voice, turning to her sharply. Nothing, Lieutenant. Something to report? I asked, quickly changing the subject away. Skriold straightened, clicking her heels with the motion. Sensors report several unidentified vessels entering the system. They aren't displaying Imperial transponder codes, so it is likely they are rebel reinforcements. Do we have them on scopes? I asked. Skriold nodded, stepping aside and signaling back into the depths of the bridge. The technician was pulling them up as I left. This way, sir. The pair of us moved back through the bridge, finding our way to the bridge officer in charge of the long-range sensors. He was one of the older members, a veteran of the Clone Wars that had been brought aboard the Conqueror after his old ship, a Venator class, I wager, was decommissioned. He was good at his job and had the sort of grandfatherly disposition that made him a delight to speak to, at least outside work. When he was seated in the technician chair, Mali Hossax vanished, and Lieutenant Hossax came to the forefront. Report, Lieutenant, I commanded as I approached, arms folding behind my back as I did so. The technician turned and gave a short salute from his chair, the expected greeting during combat situations. Not a good sign. I mused as I came to rest on his left shoulder. Captain, the man greeted before turning back to his console, indicating towards one with an agitated gesture. 5 rebel ships dropped out of hyperspace at the edge of the system. Scopes place them at 12,000 meters. Composition is 1 cruiser, 4 light carriers. So close? I asked, furrowing my brow as I took in the ships before us. Have they spotted us? The largest was a Mon Calamari ship, based on intelligence records. Its oddly bulbous shape was alien to my eyes, yet the large turbolaser blisters were unmistakable. Unknown, sir. They haven't moved from their current position, nor has there been any identifiable chatter between them and the main fleet. The comms officer, seated next to Hossax, stepped in there, pulling his headset off to address the group. Reinforcements? Skriold asked, drawing my attention. She had brought one hand up to her mouth, subconsciously gnawing on her index fingernail as she studied the console. Or latecomers, I offer, turning away from the console, but I don't want to give them the chance. Helm, take us 90 degrees starboard, pitch 3 down by our keel, keep her so. I ordered, moving towards the front of the bridge again. Aye, sir. 90 degrees starboard, 3 degrees by the keel. The helm officer repeated from the lower deck, repeating it again to the helmsman. Very well. Calms, order the Intimidation to follow our movements but maintain distance. I want the Victory picket to mirror them on the port side. The remainder of the squadron may move at their discretion, but remain within the formation. The Calms officer's affirmation was barely audible over the energized chaos that had taken the bridge, but it was heard all the same. I could forgive his breaking of protocol by not repeating the order back, for I was probably as excited if not more so than my men. My first real battle, against a real foe. I thought, taking a few soft, calming breaths when I was alone at the front of the bridge. Stay calm, Rivager. There's one real ship in that lot, this'll be a walk in the park. Like taking your XP-38 out, smooth and simple. Squadron in position, sir. The Calms officer repeated from his station, silence greeting him now as the bridge crew awaited my orders with bated breath. The Conqueror had turned enough for me to see the hostile force, as distant as they seemed from here. Only the haphazard shape of the alien cruiser was easily visible, serving as the final reminder of the coming battle. Very good. Helm, set engines to cruising speed, steady as she goes. Have the squadron match and ready long-range weapons. Hold fire until I give the order. The squadron set forth at a steady pace, warily scanning the area around the newcomers for any sign of a trap. Their lack of a reaction to our approaching procession boded poorly, but I would not waver. If there was some trap at hand, then I would have faith in my men to execute their tasks accordingly. Turbolaser batteries will be in range in 30 seconds, sir. An officer announced. Very well. Matred, I turned to address the fighter tactical officer, Wyatt Drew Matred, scramble all first stage fighters, priority on enemy bombers. Protect our advance. Matred, seated at a series of consoles opposite Hossax, nodded from his position and turned to begin relaying the order. Soon after, hordes of TIE fighters flowed from the fleet, their familiar scream hidden muffled by the vacuum of space and the thick hull of the Conqueror. The glow of their engines made a dazzling light show in front of the fleet, like a wall of titanium and quadanium. At last, the rebels appeared to recognize the force bearing down on them as Imperial. The cruiser had turned to face my ships. The small, arrow-shaped carriers rapidly fled behind the cover of their larger comrade, but it would be to no avail. Turbolasers in range, Captain. At last, the words I had been waiting for reached my ears. My heart raced, my palms grew sweaty, yet the grin I hadn't even realized I had been wearing grew vastly. All ships, fire at will. Tear that cruiser apart. My words were greeted by a cacophony of raging turbolaser fire, igniting the dark void with vibrant green, all sent in a cascading storm towards the unfortunate rebel ship. The invisible deflector shield caught the barrage, detonating turbolaser bolts dangerously close to the hull. The deadly fire of my turbolasers was soon joined by blue iron blasts and glowing, crimson missiles launched by the Victory cruisers. The rebels were not entirely lethargic, fighters and other assorted snub craft spilling from the cruiser's hangar bays. The cruiser itself, now finding its own weapons within range, began a desperate return fire. Instead of spreading its turbolaser fire between all its assailants, it focused on just one, the Conqueror. Red bolts impacted close to the hull of my ship, dissipating on its considerable forward deflector shields. Evidently realizing the futility of their current actions, the rebels' return fire became focused on the typical weak points of the Conqueror, the heavy turbolasers located next to the command tower, the two shield generators on top of the bridge and the massive reactor bubble on the ship's underside. Captain, the enemy carriers are retreating. I paused for a moment, looking from the cruiser to the area behind it. The carriers, which I had not been paying attention to until now, had vanished from view behind the large cruiser. While their fighters and bombers continued to flit about, the latter of which was constantly harassed by my own fighters, the carriers themselves were hidden. "Lieutenant Skriold has the con," I ordered, turning away from the view screen and marching back through the bridge. Skriold snapped off a salute before barking her own orders out to the crew. My attention was drawn to the comms officer. "Open communication with the Intrepid," I ordered, taking one of the extra headsets hanging on the officer's console. The man nodded before setting about his work, bringing the communications array online. Whilst he worked, I turned my attention to the sensor officer's console. My squadron's arrow-headed formation acted as the focal point of its display, centered on the Conqueror. A short distance in front of us was the oddly shaped rebel cruiser, its sizable mass hiding the four wedge-shaped carriers from direct view. "Intrepid here," the commanding officer of the Victory Picket crackled through the connection, his tone severe and uncompromising. "Arul Thron, do you have a line of sight on the enemy carrier group?" I asked, calling him by his name rather than his rank. "Negative, Captain. The enemy cruiser is blocking our firing arcs. Permission to break formation and pursue." "Denied," I responded after a moment of consideration. "Maintain formation and focus fire on the cruiser. Conqueror out." At my command, the comms officer quickly changed communication to the Intimidation. "Intimidation reporting." Miljan's stately voice, far clearer thanks to the Intimidation's more modern communication array, droned through the headset. "Do you have a clear line of sight on the enemy carrier group?" "Affirmative, Captain, but that cruiser is blocking our firing arcs." "Orders. Pursue and destroy, those carriers cannot be allowed to escape." I was confident, for the most part, that my remaining ships could handle the cruiser. It did not have the firepower to break my flagship's shields, and it was only a matter of time before its own shields fell. "Take a pair of auxiliary cruisers." "Good hunting." "Received, Captain. They won't escape." Soon after Miljan cut his communication, the Intimidation drifted past the Conqueror, over the starboard side. Its considerable mass was shadowed by two of the Strike-class cruisers. Though he had been given the task of hunting down the carriers, Miljan evidently did not want to waste the opportunity to get a few hits in on the enemy cruiser. Bright green and blue lances continued to blast out from his port weapon systems as he passed the smaller ship. "Enemy shields dropping," was heard over the dull roar of turbolasers and the din of crew members working. I turned to face the front of the bridge quick enough to witness the shields of the cruiser collapsing. Detonations erupted across its thick hull, shearing off durasteel and support systems alike. "Open communication across the entire squadron," I ordered the comms officer, covering the microphone to my headset for a moment. Once the man had executed my order, I addressed the squadron as a whole. "All ships. Priority targets are the weapon systems. Cripple these rebels." A cheer erupted across the bridge at my words, invigorating the crew further with the sweet taste of victory. Though my words were imperious and commanding, I was not so calm on the inside. My emotional state could best be described as giddy. My first true victory was at hand. These were not pirates pushing spice with jury-rigged starliners, or separatist remnant radicals with barely maintained frigates, but a true cruiser. An explosion erupted across the cruiser's starboard side, shearing one of its wings from the main body. The force of the explosion, perhaps a fuel line or ammo stockpile, sent both surviving parts drifting in opposite directions. With our ion cannons silenced, additional power could be allocated to the turbolaser batteries, to devastating effect. The enemy's hull, weakened by the barrage, at last crumpled. Explosions branched out from within the cruiser, the surviving crew desperately returning fire in a bid to take one of us down with them. It was a pointless gesture, as at last the reactor went critical and involuntarily shut down all remaining subsystems. The superstructure of the cruiser, exposed to the void as it was, had nearly been split in twain, held together only by lines of durasteel to the ship's rear. An unintended consequence, I could now see past the cruiser and witness the fates of its carrier comrades. The Intimidation, which had since bypassed the doomed cruiser, used a combination of its iron cannons to disable the carriers and its turbolasers to finish the job. The escorts were mostly superfluous, their comparatively limited firepower adding little to the overwhelming weapons of the Star Destroyer. 2 carriers remained, those that had been at the head of the route no doubt, but their time to escape was cut short. Both small craft suffered the full firepower of either side of the Intimidation's mirrored weapons. The whole battle lasted all of 10 minutes, ending with the total destruction of the opposing force for limited losses on our side. The fighter battle was still ongoing, but one-sided now that the rebels had lost their command structure. The infamous X-Wings were overwhelmed by sheer numbers, destroyed, and left their bomber counterparts to protect themselves. The bridge erupted into cheer, elated by their victory over the rebel ships. I allowed myself a small smile, basking in what I felt to be my first earned victory. I allowed the celebrations to carry on for a minute or so before addressing the comms officer. Very good. Comms, order the Intimidation to fall back into formation and the fleet to hyperspace contact. A voice, the sensor officer, cut me off, effectively silencing the bridge to the point that nary a breath could be heard. No Imperial transponder, and she's big. Fack, she's jumping right on top of us. Language, Skriold began to admonish the officer, but was interrupted by my own expletive. Fack. Tell the Intimidation to come about and prepare to receive. I barked, pointing at the comms officer. The man quickly relayed the orders as I turned to address Skriold. Her slightly betrayed look, I was breaking protocol regarding language, was ignored as I continued, Lieutenant, I leave the ship to you, keep us alive. Sir, the woman saluted, her earlier irritation at my language choice forgotten as the gravity of the situation seemed to fall over her. While the sensor officer was not specific on how big this newcomer was, his concern with its sensor profile in hyperspace was telling of what we were dealing with. Please be Imperial. I thought desperately, standing at the front of the bridge with my headset still on. Please, by all the stars of Naboo, be Imperial. And then it appeared. The new ship was, as the sensor officer predicted, massive, nearly equal to my Conqueror in length alone. Its bulbous shape and tan hull immediately told me we were not dealing with an Imperial new arrival. The ship was alien and unfamiliar, but its size was compounded by the sheer multitude of weapons it carried. A rebel capital ship, similar to the ones presently engaged at the second Death Star. In Imperial officer circles, there were few ships believed capable of fighting an Imperial class, or any of its myriad of variants and successors, on equal footing. Perhaps the most common was the Lucrehue class of ships, monstrous ships capable of carrying thousands of fighters and hundreds of weapon systems while still having space to spare for thick armor. Not only did they have the means to meet modern Star Destroyers gun for gun, at least the old Separatist battleship variants, they easily surpassed them with shields and armor. Second was the Bulwark-class battlecruisers, namely the Bulwark 3. While its predecessors were decent warships in their own right, at least as far as Clone Wars ships went, the Bulwark 3 held significant firepower and armor worthy of their title. Thankfully, they were even rarer than Lucrehue, so it was not as if I was expected to stumble into one on patrol. Modern battlecruisers and dreadnoughts could best Star Destroyers with relative ease, but most of those were under Imperial control. Most Clone Wars-era ships, even the infamous Providence-class dreadnought, weren't a match for the vaunted ISD. Indeed, it was a challenge to find many modern ships that could. The Star Destroyer killers came and went, but few ever stuck around. However, with the introduction of Mon Calamari designs and their recent revolution against the Empire, their ships had proven eager contenders for the title. Officially, they did not have any capital ships, real heavy cruisers or battleships, but only a fool believed the official stories. Because sitting right in front of my flagship was one such cruiser, its sides bristling with firepower. I nearly jumped as the Conqueror's guns roared to life, peppering the port flank of the cruiser with everything it had. Lances of green and blue impacted the shield, showing no notable effect despite the short range and unrelenting focus. The auxiliary craft of my squadron joined their fire with that of the Conqueror, and no doubt the Intimidation was desperately pummeling the large ship as well. Even with this combined might, Nothing got through. Helm, reverse thrust. Skriold barked out, evidently noticing the lacking effectiveness of our turbolaser fire. How in blazes are its shields up? One officer near me said aloud, his voice alight with either fury or jealousy. She just got out of hyperspace. Mon Cal's ships have heavily redundant shielding, more cost-effective than one big barrier like Star Destroyers. Another responded. Any further conversation was silenced as the rebel ship finally began to return fire. Unlike its smaller cousin, this cruiser did not need to focus its fire on any one target, instead spreading its weapons out across my entire squadron. While the return fire was ineffective in its current intensity against my ship, the victories were another story. The Torment reports shields are at 70% and dropping, Captain. Enemy shields are still holding. Turbolaser bays 15 through 23 are overheating and will soon be inoperable. In a moment, certain victory devolved into certain defeat. I could only stare, truly awestruck, by the rebel ship before me. My main warships were divided, unable to focus their fire on any one location. My fighters were out of position and the bombers were still trapped in the hangar bay, trapped by the hail of turbolaser fire pummeling our shields. My auxiliary ships were too soft to engage the rebels directly and buy us time, and the Victory-class cruisers. A bright flash briefly blinded me. The Torment is lost, sir. Stars above. I was going to die here. Me, my entire crew, and my squadron were going to die because I didn't question why the rebel ships were just waiting for us. I didn't think to prepare for a potential ambush and sent my second Star Destroyer off to chase down a few inconsequential carriers. Now, some rebel ship with a fraction of its effective shields was going to wipe out my entire squadron in its first engagement. I looked out at the cruiser, hopeless and terrified. I watched as ion cannon fire impacted the shield, followed by a concussion missile that slipped through the opening and into the wait. Blinking, I stepped away from the communications officer and looked more closely at the shield of the enemy ship, waiting for something to happen again. I did not have to wait long as one of the ion cannons scored a hit on the shields. A turbolaser bolt, which had been following the ion cannon blast, managed to slip through and detonate on the cruiser's hull. The damage was inconsequential compared to how massive the cruiser was, a little plasma scoring if anything. The answer to my predicament came. Swirling heck, I'm a moron. Lieutenant Skriold, I'm taking the con. Aye, sir. Captain Tullius has the con. Skriold, always one to take things in stride, responded, stepping back and returning to assisting the other officers. I returned to my position on the bridge, hands folding behind my back. My next path was clear, now I just needed to see it through. After all, there was only one enemy ship. Weapons, cut power from the turbolasers. Funnel that and any auxiliary power we have into the ion cannons. I ordered, pointing down at the weapons officer. The man looked up at me, confusion melding with desperation as he tried to understand what I was doing. Still a man to follow orders, he merely saluted. Aye, sir. Cutting power from turbolaser batteries and redirecting to ion cannons. Calms, send an order out to the squadron. The Conqueror will focus its fire onto one spot, follow our lead with turbolasers and missiles only. Chief Matred, I turned to point at the older man, who straightened when he was addressed. Be ready to scramble your bombers, they'll have their chance soon. Keep the enemy fighters away from the auxiliary craft, they'll need all the cover they can get. Captain. Matred responded, returning to his console with the utmost haste. The barrage from the Conqueror slowed until not even a laser cannon was firing. I was moving a large amount of power across my weapon systems, so I could not waste any on superfluous systems. It took all of a few minutes to completely shift power, but the rebel cruiser did not remain stationary. Perhaps sensing weakness from my flagship, the massive ship began to turn, bringing more of its weapons into range. The barrage of turbolaser and ion cannon fire briefly blinded me as they impacted the shields, but the system soon compensated and allowed us a view back into the void. Despite the fact that I commanded an Imperial-class Star Destroyer, I was awed by the sheer firepower this cruiser could bring to bear. Incomparable shields, monstrous hangar space, and a commendable number of weapons. If the Mon Cal built dreadnoughts, we would be lost in a month. But it was all for naught. Forced to continuously siphon power into its shields, the cruiser could not dedicate enough energy to break the Conqueror, not without more time, at least. And time had run out. Iron cannons ready, Captain. Bombers are awaiting commands, Captain. Squadron ready, Captain. What are your orders? The rebel cruiser had finally managed to bring its bow about, pointing towards my flagship in a last, desperate bid to provide a narrower profile and bring more of its weapons into position. All ships target the enemy cruiser, center mass. Follow our lead, fire. And all hell broke loose. Bolts of blue energy lanced out from my ship, empowered by the energy from the turbolaser batteries. The shield bubble of the rebel cruiser flickered, desperately holding on until, at last, it broke. There was no dying scream, no flash of light. One moment, there was a shield, and the next, there was not. Iron cannon blasts ineffectually impacted the hull of the cruiser, which served as a signal to the squadron. All at once, the turbolasers and concussion missiles returned, streaking past the Conqueror and into the opening we had made. Individually, the ships of my squadron would have been a nuisance at best to the cruiser, light damage they would be forced to accept before the shields came back online. Together, all firing at the same exposed spot? No contest. The hull didn't crack so much as it melted under the intense heat, weakened metal being blasted away by the concussion missiles of my heavier cruisers. The bombers sent their proton torpedoes into the cacophony of ordnance, proton torpedoes punching through what armor was left in the bath to the cruiser's soft interior. Even the Intimidation, trapped on the other side of the cruiser and thus far ignored, began a bombardment of its own, if the explosions to the cruiser's rear were anything to go by. No doubt realizing the danger it was in, the cruiser began to redirect its firepower away from the Conqueror and towards the nearest threat, one of the two surviving Victory cruisers. It was too little, too late. Even as the guns to my ship fell silent and the process to normalize power distribution began, the rest of the squadron was not so hindered. The shields of the cruiser fell wholesale, exposing the rest of the superstructure to attack. At my command, the lighter auxiliary ships began targeting the enemy weapon systems, crippling them in their death throes. Much like its smaller cousin, the cruiser found itself ripped apart, exposing its crew and delicate interior to the merciless vacuum of the void. The reactor, nestled deep within the ship's hull, was evidently hit by a glancing turbolaser or punctured by a concussion missile, as its end was far more violent than the other MC-80. A multicolored explosion erupted from the heart of the cruiser, finishing the job my ships had started in splitting the cruiser. Unlike the victory over the smaller MC-80, silence gripped the crew. Was it shock that they felt now? I could not say, for the only emotion I felt at the moment was relief for surviving what could have been a catastrophe. And then? Cheer. The crew, many either years out of practice or inexperienced green officers, erupted into jubilation. To destroy a smaller cruiser was one thing, but to best a ship equal to a Star Destroyer was another entirely, especially with as minimal of losses as we suffered. There would be time to grieve those lost, but we survived another day. Lieutenant, I turned to face Skrield, who had a smile on her face despite the serious facade she tried to put forward. Order the Intimidation to return to the previous position alongside the squadron, and the con is yours. Of course, sir. The woman responded with a crisp salute before a more serious, albeit in a mocking sort of way, expression overtook her face, and I would suggest removing your smile, sir. Briefly taken aback, I brought a hand to my mouth. As the woman said, my lips curled into a full smile of their own accord. Giving Skrield a nod of thanks, I forced my expression into something more serious and befitting an officer of the Navy. Still, I allowed the crew their jubilation. After all, it was a day of victory for us all, the Empire, the squadron, and the crew. The Conqueror turned to face the battle once more, but something was different this time. For a moment, I could not place my finger on it. The fleet of Star Destroyers was still present, as was the rebel force, as reduced as both sides appeared to be. Hey, "Where's the executor?" one officer asked dully. His voice was somewhat lost against the generally good cheer of the bridge. Now that he pointed it out, I also noticed that the flagship of Death Squadron was missing in action. Its destruction was preposterous, so the question was why it had retreated or left. Had the rebels managed a lucky, crippling strike against the monstrously sized? An explosion ignited in the center of the battle, blinding me even at this tremendous distance. I threw up an arm to cover my eyes, wincing at the intensity of the flash. Fortunately, it passed as soon as it came, forcing me to blink spots from my eyes. I wondered for a moment if I had been partially blinded by the light, and in the moment after that, I wished I had. For the second Death Star was gone, and in its place was only slagged metal and broken pieces. Capital ships: Conqueror, Imperial I-class Star Destroyer, Captain Rivager Tullius, Commander Rius Harand, Lieutenant Ashka Skriold, Chief Wyatt Drew Matred. Intimidation, Imperial I-class Star Destroyer, Commander Meljan. Cruisers: Intrepid, Victory I-class Star Destroyer, Captain Bjorn Aril Tron. Torment, destroyed, Victory I-class Star Destroyer. Steadfast, Victory I-class Star Destroyer, Captain Zanus. Viscount, Strike-class medium cruiser. Contester, Strike-class medium cruiser. Absolution, Strike-class medium cruiser, Lieutenant Pax. Valor, Strike-class medium cruiser, Commander Titus Kane. Frigates: Spite, Karak-class light cruiser. Loner, Karak-class light cruiser, Lieutenant Lobanik. Dugnad, Karak-class light cruiser, Lieutenant Axel Allberg. Vadser, Karak-class light cruiser, Lieutenant Svein Bergstow. Karak-class light cruiser. Corvettes: Overlord, Lancer-class frigate, Captain Forster. Justice, Lancer-class frigate, Commander Titus. Ordal, Lancer-class frigate, Commander Anders Larsen. Diligence, Lancer-class frigate. Chapter 2, Endor 2. From my earliest days in the Imperial Navy, I had the solidity of the chain of command drilled into my head. Everyone had a superior up until the very top, and if that superior were to perish, there was always someone that could replace them. Yet, what happened when the very top of that pyramid was killed, the Emperor himself? The chain of command for the Navy was clearly defined in the regulations, but who was supposed to take over control of the Empire when the Emperor died? For a moment, my mind toyed with the idea of disbelief. I could not believe that the Emperor was capable of dying, but in combat situations refusing to believe the situation before your eyes was a recipe for disaster. Almost against my will, the shock was pushed aside by discipline and training. With a breath to steady my rapidly beating heart, I turned on my heel and studied my crew. They were all frozen, eyes glued to the transparent steel viewscreen with varying degrees of disbelief on their faces. Evidently, my initial fears were shared by the bridge crew at large, as each attempted to accept the possibility, the certainty, that the Emperor was dead. There was no denying it. Governor Gergerod had announced the Emperor's arrival on the station. It had been repeated time and again in their briefings, and even reconfirmed by the bridge crew of the second Death Star. What's more, the head of our leadership had been decapitated in one movement. The Emperor was dead, alongside Admiral Piet and his staff. It was safe to assume that Lord Vader had been aboard either the vessel or station, and was thus lost in much the same fashion. That would mean that command fell upon the Pride of Thailandia, having been serving as the secondary flagship of Death Squadron and the main communications relay for the fleet. I took another breath before steeling my expression. My words served as a whip crack to get the crew moving. Lieutenant Skriold, order the squadron to fall in with the Conqueror and be ready to move out. Maintain combat readiness, we are moving into the battle at my order, I announced, walking back into the bridge as the crew parted like waves before me. Skriold, ever a credit to her training, quickly took to the task and began relaying my orders to the squadron at large. I continued giving orders, more to get the crew moving than out of any real need. I came to a stop when I reached the communications officer, who was trying to split his attention between the empty void ahead of the Conqueror and me. Open General Fleet comms, I ordered, before raising my voice and addressing the sensor technician, and sensors, identify some sort of formation, or the location of the Pride of Tarlandia. Confirmations echoed across the bridge, and soon I was tapped into the general fleet comms for the entirety of Death Squadron. I almost wished I hadn't bothered, as the bridge was greeted by a cacophony of shouting, orders, and cries for help. The Pride of Tarlandia was supposed to organize and direct communications among the fleet, a task they now appeared to be incapable of. Command of the fleet had been thoroughly decapitated in a single strike, and now a dozen fleets that made up Death Squadron were left to squabble amongst themselves. Luckily for me and my section, we could find our fleet easily enough and rally on their position. "Keep an ear open and update me when a chain of command emerges," I ordered, leaving the communications officer to his work. The bridge crew had mostly gotten over their shock now and were rushing to make the Conqueror ready to move. It was the height of foolishness to march blindly into a war zone, but it was either wait here and risk whatever punishment the new commanders could think up for sitting outside the battle or move to support any isolated pockets. I opted for the latter option. Soon, the Conqueror began to burn at maximum speed, followed by its menagerie of support vessels. At sub-light speed, it took some time for us to reach the battle proper, but in that time we began to piece together what had happened and who was in command. The Executor, flagship of the fleet and former ship of the late Lord Vader, had been destroyed at some point before the destruction of the Death Star. With it went Admiral Piet, the commanding officer of the operation in the absence of Lord Vader and Emperor Palpatine. Roughly around that same time, the Pride of Tarlandia had also been lost, and thus the centralized command structure of Death Squadron was frayed. Some officers had already cut their losses, fleeing the battlefield and jumping from the system. Even as a lowly captain, a part of me recognized that the day could still have been ours had we rallied, yet the weakness of the Imperial chain of command was made all too apparent on this day. It was a revelation I would deal with for the years to come, but at that moment all I needed to do was rally to my fellows. And then, finally, an order came through from some semblance of command. A Captain Palion of the Chimera finally gave the order for the fleet to retreat from the battle. There was no set location to retreat to, but at that point, I didn't much think the remaining officers cared. The reaction was fairly immediate. Sections and squadrons cut their losses and fled, grouping back with their original comrades before leaving the system. Some ships, either by choice or the lack thereof, remained to fight the rebels to the bitter end. For my part, I kept my sensor and communications officers listening out for what had come of Arrowhead Command. The news we received varied from cataclysmic to merely concerning. Some claimed that the Whirlwind had been destroyed, while others instead claimed that the vessel had fled with the rest of Arrowhead Command when the order came through. In the hours that came, I kept my section placed at the edge of the furthest planetary orbit, dodging rebel ships that came to investigate or scaring away those that remained persistent. The number of Imperial forces dwindled further until there was scarcely a handful of organized pockets of resistance remaining. I was left with quite the conundrum. We had received no orders, barring that urging of Captain Palion to retreat from the system. Had we been forgotten? A trickle of fear went up my spine, but I quashed it just the same. No. Captain Thoth wouldn't just abandon us out here, wouldn't just forget he had left part of the fleet on rearguard duty. Yet even the most hopeful part of me couldn't ignore reality. Forgotten or not, it was my duty to get me and my men out of this system safely. Yet, as I came to that decision, fate decided to intervene. "Captain, we're receiving a hail request from the Eleemosynary." The name was unfamiliar enough to give me pause, wondering for a moment if the communications technician had misspoken or if I was hearing them incorrectly. Death Squadron was small enough that every captain should have been familiar with every other ship of its weight class, but to my detriment, I did not recognize the name. "Put them on," I ordered as I approached, placing myself in front of the communicator's camera and nodding to the technician. After a few moments, the console flickered to life. Instead of showcasing the video feed from the other side, text flashed across the screen reading, "Video connection unsuccessful, audio only." "This is the Conqueror," I said, but the words barely left my lips before whoever was on the other side was speaking. This is Grand Admiral Chick of the Eleemosynary. We're sending our telemetry, fall in and assist. Far from taken aback at the brusqueness of the order, I turned my gaze from the console to the sensor officer. A nod in my direction indicated the information transfer was successful. Received, Admiral. We are en route. With that, the communication was closed and the bridge returned to its earlier business. The technician overseeing the long-range scanners had already pulled up a report before I had even reached them. The distance was not so great as to make the time a major concern. A micro jump and then full burn would see us there. However, the Eleemosynary was not facing a favorable matchup. 3 rebel cruisers bore down on the vessel, supported by a collection of secondary and escort vessels. Even with the numbers I could bring to bear, it was likely that the rebels would call reinforcements of their own. The rebel presence in the system was now greater than that of the Empire, and while they had thus far decided to ignore my section, there was little doubt in my mind they would let us rescue another vessel. Grand Admiral Chick? The cyborg? Lieutenant Skriold asked, joining me at the scanner station as I gnawed at my lip. Though my fist was covering the nervous tick, I was still unable to stop, if only subconsciously. The same, I responded. I've not had the pleasure of meeting him, but reports indicated that he was aboard the Death Star II prior to its destruction. Would command not have fallen to him? Skriold asked after a moment of consideration. In that mess? It's a miracle that anyone could reign in the fleet, I said absently as the scanner readout began to appear. First was the Eleemosynary, a top-down silhouette of the Star Destroyer overlaid on a 2-dimensional map of space. Listed next to a vessel with technical readouts and more exacting coordinates for its location. What came next was 4 rebel cruisers, their unfamiliar and rounded shapes giving away their Mon Calamari origins. 3 came at the Eleemosynary from the front, while a third came at its starboard side. Further reports indicated that reinforcements were moving at sublight speeds to reinforce their fellows, placing the Star Destroyer and any would-be rescuers at a severe disadvantage. My lip gnawing had graduated now to worrying my knuckle, the salty taste of sweat barely registering to me. In my mind, indecision warred with cowardice and imperial loyalty. On one hand, Admiral Chick appeared unable or unwilling to retreat in the face of such odds, and it was my duty as an officer of the Empire to render assistance. On the other hand, moving to assist may very well cost me my life, and that of my crew as well. I closed my eyes and took in a breath, calming my frayed nerves and hyperactive mind. The disaster this day had been for the Empire could not be understated, and with every leader and planet lost, the Empire's standing worsened. This was not a matter of survival or assisting another Imperial, but rather acting in service to the Empire. It was not a choice, it was an obligation. I let my breath out and opened my eyes. Upload the data to the main holotable, I ordered the technician before raising my voice and addressing the communications officer. Order the section to fall in. Keep our formation tight and make way to the Eleemosynary with utmost haste. Responses came to me in a chorus of voices, and the bridge became a storm of action once again. My breathing was steadier now as I calmed myself and set back into a combat mindset. There was little room now for nerves. Lieutenant Skriold has the con. Chief Matred, to the command room. Skriold gave me a tense salute before ordering a new heading for the helmsman. Leaving my flagship in her competent hands, Matred and I retreated from the main section of the bridge and into the adjacent room behind it. With a hiss, the blast door separated us from the rest of the bridge. The room dimmed before the holotable at the center of the room came to life, throwing up a 3-dimensional representation of the Eleemosynary and its attackers. True to the scanner report from before, 2 of the enemy cruisers were approaching the Eleemosynary from its front on a relatively similar plane and orientation. The third was coming at the Star Destroyer from below and the starboard assailant from above. As it was angled, the Eleemosynary could bring most of its guns to bear on 3 of its attackers, but the 4th could prove troublesome. The intimidation reports minimal snub craft losses in the previous engagement. It can still field 3 full squadrons of fighters and a full squadron of bombers. Lieutenant Zanus reports that the Steadfast still has its complement of fighters, pairing that with the survivors of the Intimidation's 4th Squadron and the survivors of the Torment, then we can account for an additional full fighter squadron. And us. We suffer the near total loss of the 3rd Squadron. Bombers suffered 0 losses. That left us with 2 full wings, and a wing of bombers ready for deployment. Given the lack of definitive information on the rebel cruisers, we could not account for their true fighter numbers. However, even if the Eleemosynary had lost its entire complement, we could still field a considerable strike force. There was one known variable, gathered from the shared battle net between Imperial ships before the Pride of Tarlandia was seemingly lost, the expected weapon hardpoints of the vessels. They were split between ion cannons and medium turbolasers, with the former being favored by most vessels. They were the quintessential line holders, as I understood it, with powerful and redundant shielding, as showcased by their larger cousin a few hours earlier. At that moment, communication with the main bridge was established and the quiet command center was flooded by the voices on the other end. My glance towards the communications officer had that volume lowered and isolated to Lieutenant Skriold, limiting the sound pollution. "Damage report for you, Captain," was Skriold's first words through the connection. "Send it," I ordered, watching as text filled a section of the holotable. I cursed under my breath at the diagnosis. My little trick against the rebel heavy cruiser had fried the capacitors on most of the iron cannons or outright melted a few of their barrels. While iron cannons had never been the primary armament of the Conqueror, their loss severely limited our options against the rebel ships. "Shut them all down. Inform the Intimidation that they are our main output of iron in this engagement." "Sir." "We still have our iron torpedoes for the bombers, sir," Matred offered. I nodded slowly at this information. However, I also had to consider the fact that those bombers were TIE bombers, slow, lumbering and unshielded. Then let's hope the rebels are too distracted to ward them off. Communications, patch all squadron traffic through us. Without the Pride of Tarlandia to piggyback off of, the Conqueror would need to serve as a makeshift nexus of communication for the section. The range would be limited, but in this engagement it would need to suffice. At sublight speeds, it took us well over half an hour to reach the Eleemosynary, but we had beaten the rebel reinforcements with time to spare. The other Star Destroyer appeared worse for wear, with 2 of its heavier turbolaser batteries on the port side visibly inoperable. Gouts of flame spewed from areas where the hull had broken, before quickly dissipating in the vacuum of space. Yet, despite the damage it had clearly sustained, the Eleemosynary continued its withering fire on the attacking cruisers. One had limped some distance away, a considerable amount of its superstructure exposed to the void, while the other 3 kept the larger vessel surrounded. They were winning, but it was slow going. Steadfast and Intrepid, break off and engage the isolated cruiser. The holographic images of the twin Victory-class Star Destroyers separated from the section, gradually burning ahead of us as they pushed their engines. "Cut to cruising speed," Skriold ordered on the bridge, allowing the Intimidation to overtake us. At last, the enemy cruisers began to react to our arrival. One broke off from the attack on the Eleemosynary to engage us while the injured vessel tried to continue limping away. Linking lights began flickering around the Star Destroyer and rebel cruisers as the sensors began picking out snub craft. Only red designations were present, so either the Eleemosynary had lost her entire complement, or they were holding what remained of their fighters back. "Matred, scramble the first stage fighters and bombers. Their targets are the cruisers engaging the Eleemosynary. I leave them to your discretion." "Captain." The Intimidation reached effective firing range before the rebel cruiser, opening up with its heavier turbolaser batteries and iron cannons. At this range, even with a target as large as the cruiser, the iron cannons missed more than they hit. Still, the opening salvos rattled the cruiser, if its peeling off from the charge was any indicator. It oriented itself back, letting the underside of its shields take the preliminary bombardment. Either the rebel officer did not know the strength of his shields, or he had taken enough damage to fear the shields breaking after one salvo. Still, the ship's defenses held and it returned fire. "Viscount," Take your section past the Intimidation's starboard flank and support the Eleemosynary. Commander Miljan, keep that cruiser occupied. Aye, Captain, Miljan responded, the image of his Star Destroyer continuing its advance and laying down heavy fire on its opponent. The Viscount and several frigates broke from my main force and followed behind the Intimidation, before peeling away on its starboard side. Flashes in my peripheral vision drew my attention to the injured cruiser soaking up concussion missile blasts to its unshielded hull. While the hologram did not go into exact detail, it was obvious the ship's weakened armor was unable to resist the missiles. Enemy bombers disengaging from the Eleemosynary. Crimson Squadron, marking targets, intercept and destroy. Maitred's voice was joined by a brief highlighting of the enemy fighters in question, their glowing holograms bridging the gap between ships. Holographic indicators for the TIE Interceptor Squadron flashed to life as they raced to meet the oncoming rebels. Enemy cruiser destroyed, Conqueror. A brilliant flash indicated the destruction of the injured cruiser, its wreckage splitting apart as the Victory Star destroyers broke off. Move to assist the Eleemosynary, we will follow. Skriold, ignore the cruiser and burn ahead, the Intimidation shall keep it distracted. Aye, Captain. Helm, maintain trajectory, ahead full. Raise starboard shields by 50% and redirect excess power to the sublight engines. We couldn't feel it on the bridge, but the Conqueror rapidly reached its top speed and quickly overtook Intimidation. The remaining escorts followed behind us, though some opportunistic gunnery officers took the chance to give the rebel cruiser a few parting shots as they passed. It was at this moment that our fighters met the enemy bombers and their escorts. Several small flashes came from the cloud of green and red holographic indicators, but no sooner had they begun their bout before less than a dozen of the rebels' numbers broke off and continued on their path toward my forces. Maitred was speaking before I had time to address him. Snub fighters, likely with proton payloads. Nothing too dangerous given their numbers, still, better safe than sorry, I muttered at Maitred's dismissal, Lieutenant. Raising shields, sir. General brace. Skriold's words were followed by a singular klaxon shriek, signaling to the crew to brace for the incoming strike if they were not already prepared. The remaining officers still standing, myself included, were quick to find seats and brace themselves on the holotable or nearby consoles. The digital representations of the enemy fighters rapidly approached the Conqueror, releasing their payloads before peeling off to retreat. The remaining squadrons of TIE fighters gave chase, but it was the smaller indicators that were my focus. Proton torpedoes, even those typically carried by snub craft, could be dangerous to an unaware or distracted capital ship. The impact was anticlimactic, there was a dull roar outside the bulkhead, but no noticeable shaking in the ship itself. Watching the hologram, I saw that all the torpedoes fell short of their marks, impacting some invisible force surrounding the Conqueror. Particle shields holding at 93%, Skriold announced, sounding pleased at the failure of the rebels. Certain now that the threat had passed, I pulled myself up out of the chair I had claimed. Maitred had done the same, not pausing to point out that he was right regarding the minimal threat the rebel craft represented. As if he hadn't stopped for a moment, Maitred was back to orchestrating the squadrons. While we had been bracing, the Viscount and her escorts reached the effective range of their turbolasers and had begun pummeling the nearest of the two unengaged cruisers. While their combined firepower was not enough to damage the larger vessel, they were enough to draw a portion of its attention and energy off of the Eleemosynary. The long-range return fire was half-hearted at best and was either nimbly dodged by the Kerrix or ignored entirely by the strike cruiser. The injured Star Destroyer, with the distraction of its assailants, managed to fully turn itself and face its last attacker. The rebel cruiser lacked the firepower to pummel through the front armor of an Imperial class with any speed, and with the bombers and cruisers bearing down on it, the rebels finally cut their losses. Down one already and another of their number in a losing battle, the remaining two rebel ships broke off from their independent engagements and fled for the nearest friendly battle group. However, the one being engaged by the Viscount was forced to quickly cut power to its engines and raise its shields. A barrage of missiles slammed into the barrier not more than a couple of moments later, courtesy of the encroaching Steadfast and Intrepid. The Eleemosynary appeared content to sit back and let my forces do the fighting now, so the rebel cruiser was stuck. It was facing the wrong direction to engage its attackers, if one discounted that the Victory cruisers were still well beyond its effective range. Even still, turning around would lose the cruiser time if it wanted to make a clean getaway, considering that my Star Destroyer was still approaching. The decision was taken out of the rebel commander's hands as the TIE bombers, lumbering as they were, finally reached the ship. Small flashes on the hollow table indicated that they had fired their payload, and a moment later a brilliant flash indicated they had breached the shields of the rebel ship. The turbolaser fire that followed ensured their destruction. It was a fate shared with the other vessel fighting the Intimidation, as its armor buckled and hull split under the concentrated fire. All in all, the battle had ended in our favor as I recalled the remaining forces chasing away the surviving vessel. However, victory would be short-lived if we stayed here for much longer. Sensor indicated that the rebel ships were approaching with utmost haste. "Raise comms with the Eleemosynary," I ordered as I left the command room, blinking at the sudden light that had been absent around the hollow table. Maytread remained behind, coordinating the fighters and bombers back into the hangar bays of the surviving vessels wherever they would fit. The officer was quick in following my commands, and it appeared that the Eleemosynary still had an operable communications system. At the officer's signal, I began speaking. "Eleemosynary, this is the Conqueror. The enemy forces have been repulsed. What is your status? Conqueror, I shall be taking over this section. Form up on the Eleemosynary and prepare to receive rebel reinforcements." The gruff voice of the Grand Admiral cut me off, causing me to splutter for a second as I had not expected his words. It took me more than a few moments to understand what he had said, and it took everything in me not to exclaim my confusion. "Admiral, we've neither the resources nor the ships to face the entire rebel force," I reasoned, attempting to not make my words combative or detracting from the ranking officer. Not only was it not in my nature to speak out like this, but it was an unspoken rule of the Navy to never speak against one's superiors, be it in private or publicly. Only the most naive or ambitious would try, but few would make such an attempt against a Grand Admiral. Yet, despite my nature, I knew that our defeat would be certain. Despite the relatively fresh state of my forces, the Eleemosynary appeared to be heavily damaged. 2 fully operational Star Destroyers, an injured third, and a motley collection of escort ships was hardly an intimidating force against a fleet. "Then we shall die an honorable death avenging our Emperor and this defeat, Captain." The tone of Chick was dismissive at first, but now there was clear hostility and derision. I grit my teeth, fighting down the urge to worry my lip as I thought out what to say next. "The fleet has already withdrawn from the system, sir. We must rally our forces and put forth a unified strike. I will not have a lowly escort captain speak to me about sound tactics." The designation for my section was displayed alongside our IFF tags. "Admiral, it would be the height of foolishness to play into the rebels' hands now." I spoke quickly as Skriold approached, a worried look to her otherwise stern expression. "Bad news. We must allow cooler heads to prevail and plan an appropriate response to today's events. All we will be doing is sacrificing loyal Imperial lives and warships for a suicidal attempt at revenge." Of course, it was also the height of foolishness to attempt and play at the Admiral's compassion for his men. Chick had earned a reputation throughout the years as a brutal and hard man, viewed as an attack dog, a thing, for the Empire. I had no intention of remaining, but it would look poorly upon me if I left the Admiral to die without trying to escort him to safety. Nor could I forgive myself for abandoning my fellows to the tender mercies of the rebels. Rebel ships managed to microjump. "They are 15 minutes out at their current speeds," Skriold whispered in my ear, earning a nod. Though she still had command of the Conqueror, only I could give the order to retreat. I had already accepted Chick's resolve to die here and sacrifice his men, and made a signal for the operator to change our channel back to the section. Then, Chick spoke again with a sigh. "Your reasoning is sound, Captain. Our hyperdrive is operational. Plot a course out of this damned system." The man sounded almost defeated, even over the communication speaker. I blinked, more surprised than anything that my words spoken in desperation had managed to get through to him. "Forwarding our heading now," I responded mechanically, muting the communicator and staring unblinkingly at Skrield. Even she seemed surprised that I had talked a Grand Admiral down, mouthing the word, "really" to me. I gave a minute shrug, uncertain if she picked up the movement. "Navigation, chart us a course out of here. Whatever's quickest, just get us out," I ordered, walking over to the command pit as if that would add emphasis to my order. The pit officer repeated the command unnecessarily, but I found that following the procedure calmed my nerves as well, so I did not begrudge the man. I pointed back at the communications officer I had just walked away from, continuing my orders. "Keep the eleemosynary between us and the intimidation." "Aye, sir." Almost as one, the 3-star destroyers turned to face the nearest hyperspace egress point in the system. It was a clear shot, away from the wreckage of the Death Star and the largest concentration of rebel forces. My earlier concerns regarding the eleemosynary were unfounded, it seemed, as the other Star Destroyer kept pace even as emergency crews rushed to patch up any holes or put out major fires. While the port-side heavy turbolasers still appeared inoperable, they no longer had gouts of plasma and flame shooting off of them, so I considered that an improvement. 6 minutes to egress point, Captain," the pit officer nearest navigation announced to the bridge, causing a momentary flurry of action. The guns were locked in place, the hangar bays were closed, and the shields officers were ready at their station to lower their namesake. Ahead of us, the grey bodies of my lighter escorts acted as our vanguard. We wasted no time in making a jump to lightspeed. The rebels were the nearer side of a full light minute behind us, and though it appeared they were no longer chasing us in earnest, I was not eager to wait around and see. First, it was the escorts, their hyperdrives quicker to fire given the size of the ships, but soon our 3-star destroyers followed them into the dizzying miasma. "Captain," I turned to face Matred as the officer approached, though not before taking a cautionary step away from the command pit. "Grand Admiral Chick is waiting for you on the holo." I blinked, momentarily surprised, before thanking the officer and leaving for the command room. Certain that Skrield would get us out of the Endor system safely, I left oversight of the section in her capable hands. The interior had been lit up once again, with the majority of the technicians present still working at their station. A couple were standing nearer to the elevator, discussing something, though they did stop long enough to salute me as I approached. I nodded to them, allowing the pair to return to their conversation as I fiddled with the holotable. Inserting my code cylinder into the available port, I used the security access to accept the priority message. After a moment, the lights automatically dimmed, the effect of which was hampered somewhat by the light bleeding in from the main bridge, and the holotable flickered to life. It took a moment for the hologram to coalesce, but when the form of Chick I had to fight down a flinch at his appearance. The Commission for the Preservation of the New Order, or COMPNA, had always placed a heavy emphasis on the purity of the human form. Alien genetics and obvious cybernetics were often frowned upon, if not openly shunned, within imperial society, especially in those worlds with an overwhelming human population. A part of me wondered how much truth there was to the reputation of Grand Admiral Oswald Chick as a brutal and emotionless officer, though looking at his face now I found it challenging to argue to the contrary. For the most part, the left side of his face was left unmarred. His brown goatee still held much of its reddish-brown luster, but his age and the stresses of his life truly began to show in the lines along his face. His one good eye was sunken in and partially obscured by a bushy eyebrow seemingly stuck in a permanent scowl. Even in the hologram, I could tell his white uniform was spotless and perfectly pressed, adding to the machine-like presence the man held. It was his other side that served to be the most noteworthy. The right side of his face was a mess of metal plates, criss-crossing wires, and a single, baleful red eye set into the man-made head. Even as Chick's left eye blinked or gave subtle twitches to show that he was still human, that cybernetic eye remained still and unblinking at all times. The damage that had claimed his face moved down his body as well. His right arm, hidden though it was in the sleeve of Chick's tunic, was obviously mechanical. The way the sleeve hung off the arm, as if it had not been fitted for the appendage, gave away the straight edges of machined parts. All in all, Grand Admiral Chick cut an intimidating figure even when he was not staring down at me with a severe and unabiding expression. "Captain Tullius," the man said in place of a greeting, and though I was surprised he knew my name, I saluted all the same. "Admiral Chick, your logs indicate your section suffered battle damage. Will you still be operable until we reach safe harbor?" For a moment, I was confused as to how he had accessed that information given I had yet to release it to the Imperial battle records, before remembering that he was a Grand Admiral and likely had the authority to override the ship's security. "Yes, Admiral. We suffered some losses prior to reaching your ship, but the remainder of the vessels are fully operational," I report, careful to not phrase our timely intervention as helping or saving the Grand Admiral. It was a lesson I took to heart, as while Hask had never spoken to me and Captain Thoth was not an especially egotistic officer, it was dangerous to prod the ego of the Admiralty. If Chick noticed this, he did not show it. The same cannot be said for my vessel. What is the status of Death Squadron and the rest of the fleet? Who is in command? We were getting mixed reports, sir. Some indicated Yagtu in the Inner Rim, while others supposedly retreated to Anaj. But without the pride, we're all blind. Very well, regardless of the squadron's fate, we need fuel and repairs. The Elamos Inaries connection to the Holonet is offline. What is the nearest loyal Imperial base? I turned away from the Admiral to repeat the request to the command room's navigator, only to find the man already approaching with a datapad in hand. The navigator had anticipated the request and went ahead with locating local depots. I gave a nod of thanks at his salute, making note of where the officer had been seated as his name escaped me at that moment. While naval doctrine typically frowned on the ranks acting without orders, I was never one to refuse positive initiative from my crew. The list was organized with the present fuel of my section, but at this end of the galaxy, choices were sparse. Some of the names were passingly familiar, as the officers had all been informed where the nearest Imperial supply depots or points of interest were in this sector. Baccarat, Anaj, Ponamar, just to name a few. Baccarat was out of the question. We were moving away from the world and the navigator placed it as being an additional week trip if we were to turn around. Anaj would be the next logical choice, being the supply depot for Death Squadron, but then it became an issue of distance. Had we escaped along the designated hyperlane connecting the Endor system to Anaj, we wouldn't have had an issue. However, in our haste to escape, we had not taken the correct egress point. Our current trajectory put us on course for the Vasha system, one so minor it had not even been included in my sector reports. However, we could jump for Ponamar and Roth Station, the Imperial base overseeing the Model sector. I voiced as much to Chick, who was silent for a moment before responding. Roth Station. My flag was too heavily damaged. I need to stop and refuel if I'm to make it. We could make a stop in a local system and send one of my ships ahead to get support. I offered, eyes darting over the map as if it would suddenly offer me a solution. Out of the question. I've no doubt the rebels are scouring this sector for any remnants of Death Squadron. Sending a ship out on its own will weaken us more than I am willing to accept. I hummed for a moment before finally picking out a system. Vasha, which we were already en route to, had a minor space station that was likely acting as a trading post out on this corner of the galaxy. Scarcely any information was available on the databanks, but it was our only option that was not back toward the bulk of the rebel fleet. Vasha may be our only recourse then, sir. A small trading post and no Imperial presence, notable or otherwise. We can likely appropriate the resources we need to make our way to Roth Station. If the station was still operational or in Imperial hands, of course. The disaster at Endor had likely expanded across the sector as Death Squadron scattered to the winds. Still, we had 3-star destroyers of questionable operability in our number plus the collection of escort ships. Unless we met the entire rebel fleet, we could just strong-arm any hesitant administrators into doing what we wanted. It was hardly the noblest tactic, but in the debate between honor and survival, I would pick the latter in a heartbeat. Breathing in a sigh, I turned back to the communicator as Chick spoke. Vasher? Desert world, ostensibly loyal. Their lack of garrison will at least guarantee their cooperation. Very well, set course for that system, Captain. Sir, I salute, as the hologram of Chick flickered and died. At the edge of an uninhabited system, 3 star destroyers and their escorts briefly exit hyperspace. They spent all of half an hour there, reorganizing before rushing to the nearest egress point and leaving the system as quickly as they arrived. Trudging along, unnoticed by the small squadron, an old Imperial probe blinked softly, sending its distress signal into the uncaring void. Capital ships: Conqueror, Imperial I-class Star Destroyer, Captain Rivager Tullius, Commander Rius Harand, Lieutenant Ashka Skriold, Chief Wyatt Drew Matred. Intimidation, Imperial I-class Star Destroyer, Commander Miljan. Cruisers: Intrepid, Victory I-class Star Destroyer, Captain Bjorn Aril Tron. Torment, destroyed, Victory I-class Star Destroyer. Steadfast, Victory I-class Star Destroyer, Captain Zanus. Viscount, Strike-class medium cruiser. Contester, Strike-class medium cruiser. Absolution, Strike-class medium cruiser, Lieutenant Pax. Valor, Strike-class medium cruiser, Commander Titus Kane. Frigates: Spite, Karak-class light cruiser. Lona, Karak-class light cruiser, Lieutenant Lobanik. Dugnad, Karak-class light cruiser, Lieutenant Axel Ulberg. Vadser, Karak-class light cruiser, Lieutenant Svein Bergstow. Corvettes: Overlord, Lancer-class frigate, Captain Forster. Justice, Lancer-class frigate, Commander Titus. Ordal, Lancer-class frigate, Commander Anders Larsen. Diligence, Lancer-class frigate,